Chapter 22 starts with a quote from George Orwell. As I write, highly civilized beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me. They do not feel any enmity against me as an individual, and nor I against them. They are only doing their duty. From The Lion and the Unicorn, 1941. So just to cover off, we are covering now the period from autumn 1939 to December 1941. Advances in aviation technology had made the aerial bombing of Britain inevitable, though some people in Cambridge could not believe the Germans would ever bomb a town of such beauty. Nuclear weapons were being discussed too, in newspapers and popular magazines, but most of the public and national leaders seem not to have noticed. Dirac, aware of the potential of nuclear fission, had an inkling of what might be in store, like many scientists. He would soon have to decide whether to drop his research and participate in the largest military program the world has ever seen. Soon the conflict would disperse Dirac's extended family across 2 continents. He waited every day for news of Betty in the Netherlands. Mansi was worried about her Jewish relatives, especially her parents and sister, who had left Budapest and settled in New York State, assisted by Wigner and his new wife Mary. Although she strongly supported the war, Mansi knew the pain of being suspected as an alien and smarted at the subtle signs of disapproval from strangers when she revealed her thick accent, which many took to be German. In her adopted country, she felt like a bloody foreigner. When the Diracs ventured into the centre of Cambridge on the freezing nights of January 1940, they saw that much of the town looked as it did in Newton's day. Under the moonlight, the architecture of the city, the college buildings, King's Parade, Senate House, had never looked more sublime. The mood of the town was, however, becoming more apprehensive. Thousands were bracing themselves for an attack, ready to flee to the new bomb shelters. Dirac and his family stayed indoors, carefully observing the blackout, preventing every shard of light from escaping into the night by covering their windows with black paper. By 6 o'clock each night, the town was as quiet as a village on Sunday morning, and by 10 it was almost deserted. The church bells had been silenced, the street lamps switched off. At the beginning of the war, the population of the town had swelled by almost 1/10 to around 80,000. At the beginning of September 1939, trainloads of children had arrived from London and other towns that were expected to be the targets of enemy bombers. These evacuees, many with their home addresses written on their luggage labels tied around their necks, were billeted with local families, many of which received them less warmly than sentiment now recalls. The Diracs did not take in any of these children, although in the coming months they saw them virtually overrun the whole town. Everyone, including the dons, carried around a foul-smelling rubber gas mask. For the time being, at least, academics in their gowns had lost their special status and were no more important than the thousands of volunteers and part-time workers who were preparing for war. The texture of day-to-day conversations changed. People talked more loudly, endlessly repeating catchphrases such as, "I'm doing my bit," and "Don't you know there's a war on?" All over the town, posters warned that Careless talk costs lives. Words that looked comically alarmist, as there were no signs of any imminent conflict. By March 1940, nothing much had happened since the declaration of war, since the collapse of Poland, and the restless public called it the phony war, or sometimes the boring war. Most of the evacuated children drifted back home. Cambridge University ticked over. Though there were fewer dons, as many of them had left to take up posts in government, the armed forces, or war research establishments. There were fewer students too, but a skeleton program of teaching continued, and Dirac gave his lectures on quantum mechanics as usual. A regular visitor to the college, he saw how much its atmosphere had changed. It now accommodated not only its staff and students, but also uniformed members of the Army, Navy, and Royal Air Force, who worked in the new buildings completed shortly after the outbreak of war. The college was one of the national centres of the Air Force, and hundreds of its cadets were trained there, mixing uneasily with the undergraduates, who had different catering facilities. The menus for college members were now much more modest. At high table, about all the fellows could expect was a ladleful of mutton stew and vegetables grown on college land. Gardeners had dug up the lawns to grow onions and potatoes. At home, the Diracs lived like most others in Britain. They queued for their ration books and food coupons, and took pots and pans to local collecting points to be melted down and turned into weapons. Dirac had chopped down a tree in the garden for firewood, cultivated potatoes and carrots in a nearby allotment, and grew giant mushrooms in his cellar. But Mansi, well into her pregnancy, wanted support. She would not dispense with her servants, and she fretted at the thought of losing even one of them. Dirac's mother in Bristol was counting the days to the birth of her second grandchild, hoping that the child would be a boy and that his parents would name him Paul. But she was soon to be disappointed. The child was a girl, Mary, born on 9th of February 1940 at London's Great Ormond Street Hospital. As Mansi wrote in her notebook, Mary was a daddy's girl, as she would remain. Dirac was a doting father in his reserved way, dangling her on his knees, trying to entice her to play with a new doll sent by her godmother, Schrodinger's wife, Annie. Desperate to see her first granddaughter, Flo made a flying visit to see the baby and her mother. Flo's manner with the baby did not impress Mansi, who complained to Dirac the next day. "It is awful of me to write to you about her. You never criticise my parents, but I never felt as much that she has neither heart nor feelings. She has no notion of how to handle a tiny thing as a baby, but she picked her up. It was quite terrible to me." Dirac may have sensed that this would not be the last clash between the two women closest to him, each jealous of the other's place in his affections, but their disputes appear not to have spoiled his first new months of paternity. He now had the domesticity he craved, but it was soon disrupted by an urgent request to do something he had hoped to avoid: to join the scientists' war effort. Rudolf Peierls was now in Birmingham, a professor of physics by day and volunteer fireman by night, equipped with a uniform, a helmet and an axe. Peierls had settled in England after fleeing Nazi Germany in 1933 with his Russian wife, Genia, a former member of the jazz band of Soviet physicists. Like most scientists who had lived under Hitler, Peierls wanted him crushed, but the British authorities were slow to accept his offers of assistance. In early 1940, Peierls and his wife were officially classified as enemy aliens. The couple's naturalization papers came through later that month, so he was eligible to work on secret projects, though the authorities still looked at him with suspicion and denied his request to work on the new radar technology. In early February 1940, when Dirac was cradling his newborn daughter in his arms, Peierls was thinking about nuclear weapons. Like most scientists who were following the debate, he believed that such a weapon would not be possible after all. Niels Bohr and John Wheeler had apparently provided the clinching argument by proving that the fission of uranium by slow neutrons was entirely due to the rare isotope of uranium-235, containing a total of 235 nuclear particles, not the much more common uranium isotope, uranium-238, which contains 238 particles. A little less than 1 part in 100 of a typical sample of natural uranium is the U-235, and the rest is almost entirely U-238. It followed that if a nuclear bomb was made using naturally occurring uranium, very few nuclei would undergo fission, and any chain reaction that started would soon fizzle out. But a loophole was spotted by one of Peierls' Birmingham colleagues, Otto Frisch, the scientist who had given fission its name and had been the first to explain it. In collaboration with his aunt, Louise Metenier, Frisch was one of an almost unbroken string of bachelors who lodged with Rudolf and Genia Peierls and became part of the household, helping with the washing up and keeping their children amused during the blackout. The crucial question that Frisch asked was, suppose someone gave you a quantity of the pure 235 isotope of uranium, what would happen? When Frisch and Peierls did the calculations, they found an amount of U-235 needed was about 1 pound in weight, about the volume of a golf ball. Although it would be difficult and expensive to produce this much of this rare isotope, the resources required compared with the costs of running the war would be chicken feed. Frisch later recalled that when he and Peierls tumbled that the purification process could in principle be completed in weeks, we stared at each other and realized that an atomic bomb might, after all, be possible. Even more terrifying was the thought that the Germans might already have done the calculations and Hitler might be the first to have the bomb. Frisch and Peierls secretly typed up 2 memos on the properties of a superbomb and the implication of building one, setting their conclusions in a total of 6 foolscap pages which they sent to the British government, keeping just 1 carbon copy. The authorities were grateful, but asked them to understand that, as Peierls later recalled, henceforth the work would be continued by others as actual or former enemy aliens. We would not be told any more about it. If the government wanted scientists to build a nuclear weapon, they would need to find a way to distill uranium-235 pure from mined uranium ore which contains the mixture of 238 and 235. Several groups were set up in the UK to investigate ways of separating uranium isotopes, including ones at the University of Liverpool and at Oxford. Scientists in these groups knew that Dirac had invented one way of doing it, the centrifugal jet stream method of isotope separation, which he had investigated in the spring of 1934, but abandoned after the Soviets had detained his collaborator Kapitsa. By the late autumn of 1940, Dirac had heard that his long-discarded experiment might, after all, have important implications in developing material to make a nuclear bomb. Soon, he would be under pressure to resume his studies of the technique. In the United States, Szilard, a close friend of Mancy's brother Eugene Wigner, was trying frantically to persuade the government to develop a nuclear bomb before the Germans. He was working at Columbia University in New York with his fellow refugee Enrico Fermi, the experimentalist best qualified to build a nuclear weapon if it was possible. Progress was slow and funds were short, partly because few government officials took Szilard's hectoring seriously. In the summer of 1939, Wigner, Szilard and Teller persuaded Einstein to write to President Roosevelt, drawing his attention to the possibility of nuclear weapons and the danger that the Germans might produce one first. After a long delay, Roosevelt invited Einstein to join a committee of government advisors, but he brusquely declined and sat out the war at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, where word spread that the Nazis were indeed working on a bomb. In the spring of 1940, Dirac's friends, Oswald Veblen and John von Neumann, wrote to the director Frank Adelot, urgently seeking his assistance to fund investigations into the chain reaction. In their letter, they mentioned recent conversations with the Dutch physical chemist Peter Debye, who had led one of Berlin's largest research institutes until the German authorities sent him abroad in order to free his laboratories for secret war work. He made no secret of the fact that this work is essentially a study of the fission of uranium. This is an explosive nuclear process which is theoretically capable of generating 10,000 to 20,000 times more energy than the same weight of any known fuel or explosive. It is clear that the Nazi authorities hoped to produce either a terrible explosive or a very compact and efficient source of power. We gather from Deby's works that they have brought together in this institute the best German nuclear and theoretical physicists, including Heisenberg, for the purpose of the research, and this is in spite of the fact that nuclear and theoretical physics in general, and Heisenberg in particular, are under a cloud, nuclear physics being considered to be Jewish physics, and Heisenberg a white Jew. There is a difference of opinion among theoretical physicists, the letter goes on, about the probability of reaching practical results at an early date. This, however, is a well-known stage in the prehistory of every great invention, and the tremendous importance of the utilization of atomic energy, even if only partially successful, suggests that the matter should not be left in the hands of the European gangsters, especially at the present juncture of world history. Adelot responded by helping Szilard with his research for funding. The prime responsibility for Adelot and Veblen, however, was the Institute for Advanced Study, and they dreamt of setting up a wartime haven for the most eminent quantum physicists, including Bohr, Pauli, Schrödinger, Dirac and even Heisenberg. But when the war intensified, it became unthinkable for most of them to concentrate on anything other than the war. The pursuit of the fundamental laws of physics were set to the side. In April 1940, the Nazis overwhelmed Norway and Denmark and launched a blitzkrieg on Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands. A few weeks later, the phony war was over. Dirac's sister Betty and her family were now living in an occupied country. Joe, like all the other Jews, lost much of his freedom. He was subjected to a curfew, forbidden to ride in trams or cars, and forced to wear a yellow star when outside of his house. A month before, the German forces had conquered Denmark unopposed and had invaded Norway, swatting aside the British government's naval campaign to repel them. Chamberlain was forced out of office and replaced by Winston Churchill. The man, regarded by many as a belligerent class warrior, soon became the saviour of his country and the embodiment of bulldog spirit, a national hero. The Diracs gathered around their radio to listen to his broadcasts and report of his speeches. 3 days after he entered 10 Downing Street, he told the House of Commons in his first speech as Prime Minister that the aim was victory! Victory at all costs! Victory in spite of all terror! Victory, however long and hard the road may be! For without victory, there is no survival. Mancy was starstruck. She sent Churchill a note consisting of just 2 words, God's blessings, after a broadcast he had made a few days after the Luftwaffe dropped its first bombs on Cambridge on the 18th of June 1940. At 11:30 p.m. on that night, the air raid sirens began to wail, and the Diracs scurried down to the shelter of their cellar. Moments before midnight, they heard a Heinkel bomber dive low overhead, and after a piercing whistle, a huge explosion when the plane dropped 2 high explosive bombs about a mile away. 10 people were killed, a dozen were injured, and a row of Victorian houses was laid to waste. The following night, the bombers struck Bristol for the first time, targeting the British Aeroplane Company's factory in Filton. Dirac's mother was desperate to speak to her son, but with no telephone, the best she could do was to write to him. The awful raiders pay a midnight call every night, she wrote. The first was a downright shock on Monday. I flew down with all my dressing gowns, collected all the green cushions from the big chairs, and made myself warm and comfortable, propped against the kitchen door. To my surprise, I got intensely angry at their cheek and impudence at disturbing my night's rest and daring to visit our island in such a manner. Choosing not to take drams of whisky and play poker with her neighbours in their cellars, Flo spent most nights alone, crouched in the cupboard under the stairs with cotton wool in her ears, trying to sleep during the hours of fireworks. At 5 in the morning, when the sirens and streamers in the docks roared the all clear, she went up to Betty's room to catch up with her sleep. Flo was lonely, sick with rheumatism and gout, anxious about her family, and disappointed that her son was such a poor correspondent. I am sure you can spend 5 minutes for a few lines if you try hard, Paul, she wrote. By August of 1940, the Battle of Britain was fully underway. The Luftwaffe was pummelling London and fighting over the skies of England with the Royal Air Force, helped by the early warnings made possible by the new radar technology. Despite the widespread fear of imminent Nazi invasion, daily life in Britain continued fairly normally. Food and everyday supplies were in the shops, the trains and buses were running, and there were queues outside cinemas which were showing Gone with the Wind. It was a summer of almost uninterrupted glorious weather, and the more prosperous Britons, including Dirac, saw no need to forego their annual vacation. Dirac and Gabriel took a 4-week break in the Lake District, renting a cottage in Ullswater with Max Born and his family, his wife, their 19-year-old son Gustav, their daughter Gretel, and her new husband Morris Price, a theoretical physicist at the University of Liverpool. The outdoor life, primitive facilities, and the prospect of communal cooking were not for Nancy, who remained in Cambridge with Judy, baby Mary, and her nurse. After Dirac had assured her that the danger of air raids in Cambridge had been exaggerated. "You should not let the air raid warnings worry you too much, my dear," he wrote. While Gabriel stayed in the cottage, his head buried in a book, Dirac and Price headed off early to the mountains with a vacuum flask of hot tea and a packed lunch. With Price and Gustav Born, Dirac climbed the highest peak in England, Scafell Pike, rode on the lakes, climbed up several rock faces, and followed some of the paths trodden by Wordsworth, who had lived in nearby Grasmere. At night, the party dined on the balcony overlooking a lake, as still as a pond. It scarcely seemed possible that they were in a country fighting for its life, until they switched on the radio and heard the news from London. Barely 4 days after Dirac's vacation began, Nancy was in the cellar with Mary and Judy, following the first of several air raids. "I am very sorry to be away during these air raids," Dirac wrote to his wife, although he was not worried enough to return home. Feeling abandoned and dejected, Nancy dropped her usual affectionate tone when she wrote to him. "I know very well that you never do or did what people happen to ask you to do, so I'm not asking you for anything, but it is a question. Would you return to Cambridge if I was not here? Because if you would not, then do not come home, please." As usual, her wrath soon abated. Dirac was habituated to her outbursts, and fended them off by remaining silent. It was a singular marriage, not one most people could endure, but it was working. Dirac's climbing partner, Morris Price, formerly a colleague of Dirac and born in Cambridge, was studying isotope separation with the Liverpool team and had recently asked Dirac's advice about his centrifugal jet method. But it seems that Dirac did not think seriously about developing the method until several months later. This delay is surprising, as many of his peers were talking urgently of the need to develop a nuclear weapon ahead of the Nazis. Perhaps as much part of the explanation for his tardiness is that he was preoccupied with his stepchildren, constantly quarrelling and consuming more of his energy than he would have liked. Gabriel, then an introverted 15-year-old, was developing into a talented mathematician. Encouraged by Nancy, he revered his stepfather as a hero, looked to him for advice, and even copied his handwriting down to the last detail of the curl on the capital D. Judy, 2 years his junior, was growing into an attractive young woman, and quite different from her brother. She was lazy, headstrong, and not at all frightened of provoking her mother. Nancy's high-handedness sometimes alarmed Dirac, who privately warned Gabriel that he should not take too much notice of her tantrums. Dirac agonized about his sister and her family behind enemy lines. She had written to him from Amsterdam via the Red Cross mail service on the 3rd of July to report that she was safe, and the letter took 3 months to arrive. Shortly after he read it, Dirac heard that Dutch citizens would be fined £15,000 if they were caught listening to British radio transmissions. He was also concerned about his mother, who occasionally visited Cambridge, but spent most of her time alone in 6 Julius Road, going out only occasionally to the shops, the cinema, and to volunteer for the emergency canteen service. Bristol was the 4th most heavily bombed city in the UK, after London, Liverpool and Birmingham. Almost every night the planes attacked the city, and though Julius Road was 2 miles from the worst of the attacks, Flo was in fear of her life. She went to bed early and tried to sleep through the 7-hour barrages until the sirens blasted the all-clear signal into the dawn. These were among the darkest days of the war. Pearls in Birmingham was one of the many who believed that the fight against Hitler was then hopeless, and he recalled 14 years later. Although Germany had failed to win the Battle of Britain, the war was going its way, as Hitler well knew. He told his ally Mussolini in October 1940 that the war had been won. In mid-December, Dirac's mother was admitted to a nursing home, suffering from concussion after a stone had fallen on her when she was out walking. Dirac rushed to Bristol and, between visits to Julius Road, walked around the bombed-out heart of the city. At the Merchant Venturers College, he saw that many of the buildings he had known since he was a child had been pulverised into smouldering piles of rubble. Several of the homes on his route had been bombed out. Their once private spaces now embarrassingly on show for all to see. The middle of Bristol, he wrote, is terribly damaged. Most of the best shopping areas are in ruins, and many beautiful churches have gone, he wrote to Mancy. She too was angered by being left alone to feel. She was too angry at being left alone to feel much sympathy. You know that envy is not in me, she wrote, but I am a little revolted that you have had to go and have had to stay. After all, 60 years ought to have been enough for anybody to make friends. She is only interested in people as far as she will be able to talk about them. Unmoved, Dirac helped his mother to return home and stayed with her until she could resume her routine, returning to Cambridge shortly before the year's end. All over the UK, the New Year celebrations were subdued, for the country was pinned to the wall. Most scientists in Britain had put themselves at the service of their country. But, as usual, Dirac did not swim with the shoal. In peacetime he was part of the mainstream of physics, but always one step from it, so that his individuality was not constrained. He now had the same relationship with the scientists working for the military. He supported them, but only to an extent that neither his daily routine nor his intellectual independence was compromised. One of the first invitations to participate in war work that Dirac received had come surprisingly from the mathematician G.H. Hardy, who was contemptuous of the applied mathematics involved in war work as unworthy of a first-rate man with proper personal ambitions. He wrote to Dirac in May 1940, asking him to join a team of 12 mathematicians to code and decode messages at the Civil Defence Offices in St. Regis in the event of a Nazi invasion. Dirac appears to have declined, presumably because he could not consider moving from Cambridge and because teams, to him, were anathema. The journalist, Jim Crowther, did not, however, stop trying to involve his retiring friend in public affairs. In mid-November 1940, he tried to persuade Dirac to attend a meeting of Tots and Quats Dining Club, an informal gathering of academics who were interested in exploring how their expertise might be useful to society. The name of the club is a reference to the Latin Quot homines tot sentinere. So many men, so many opinions. Its 23 members in 1940, including Bernal, Cockcroft, Crowther, were often joined by guests such as Frederick Lindemann, H. G. Wells, the philosopher A. J. Ayer, and the art historian Sir Kenneth Clarke. The location of the club's political centre of gravity, well to the left, was reflected in the outcome of their debates, most of them held over a few bottles of wine and an indifferent meal in London's Soho. The meeting Crowther wanted Dirac to attend, on Saturday the 23rd of November 1940, was scheduled to discuss Anglo-American scientific cooperation and was to take place at Christ College, Cambridge. Crowther knew the best way to encourage Dirac to attend. It would be quite unnecessary for you to join in the discussion if you did not wish to. Crowther succeeded, and Dirac listened to a wide-ranging discussion about ways of promoting scientific cooperation with American scientists, until shortly after midnight. Bernal opposed the suggestion that British research projects should be transferred to the United States, arguing that the best way forward was to promote personal contacts between British and American scientists. It was important, he stressed, not to give up too early on preserving the independence of British science. The record of this special Tots and Quats meeting makes no mention of any contribution from Dirac. So far as records show, he attended no other social gathering of scientists throughout the war. At about the same time of the meeting, Dirac began to think again about his method of separating isotopes in mixture. 7 years earlier, he had demonstrated that the technique might work. He now turned to a theoretical analysis of the process to help engineers investigate ways of separating a mixture of U-235 and U-238. His original idea was to deflect a gaseous jet of the mixture through a large angle so that the heavier and therefore slower moving isotopes would be deflected less than the lighter ones, and the two components would separate. He tried to find a general theory of all processes that might separate isotopic mixtures in this way, aiming to deduce the conditions that would most effectively separate them. To solve the problem, he had to use all his talents: the mathematician's analytical skills, the theoretician's penchant for generalization, and the engineer's insistence on producing useful results. He gave his first account of the theory in a confidential 3-page memorandum. Dirac wrote it for Peierls and his colleagues, probably in early 1941, between the incessant bombing raids, and typed it at home. He wrote the paper in his usual spare style, but taking care to highlight the most important conclusions so that they would be clear even to engineers allergic to complicated mathematics. The memo does not focus on his own jet separation method, but concerns every conceivable way of separating isotopes in a liquid or gaseous mixture by causing a variation in the isotope's concentration. The separation might be achieved, for example, by subjecting the mixture to a centrifugal force, or by carefully arranging for the temperature to change across the container. Or to make the calculations tractable, he made the reasonable assumption that the fluid mixture contains only 2 isotopes, each one made out of simple atoms, and that the concentration of the lighter one is small compared with the concentration of the other. In a short calculation, he derived a formula for which he called the separation power of the apparatus, a measure of the minimum effort needed to cream off a given amount of the lighter isotope. He found that every part of such an apparatus, irrespective of how it is built, has to its own maximum separation power, and he showed how to calculate it. Dirac often drove to Oxford to talk with the experimenters who were developing ways of separating isotopes under the impish Francis Simon, another German refugee physicist. Dirac surprised many of the experimenters by participating vigorously in their meetings and by making practical suggestions about the design of their apparatus. During these discussions, he conceived several other ways of separating isotopes, each of them based on his original centrifuge jet stream method. The Oxford group built one of Dirac's designs, and it worked, but his method was less efficient than the competing technique of gaseous diffusion, which exploits the fact that the atoms of two isotopes in equilibrium and with the same energy have different average speeds, the lighter, swifter atoms being more likely to diffuse through a membrane than heavier ones, enabling the mixture to be separated. Consequently, at this stage in the development of nuclear energy, resources were diverted to gaseous diffusion, and Dirac's idea was set aside. Late at night on the 9th of May 1941, a bomb fell opposite the Dirac's home, damaging 2 houses and causing small fires that Judy helped the firefighters to extinguish. This was the most frightening moment for the Diracs in the worst year of the bombing in Cambridge, and it was relentless where they lived, close to the strategic target of the railway station. But the Diracs' everyday life was much the same as it was before the war. Part of this routine involved welcoming visitors. Dirac was determined not to follow his father's example of virtually barring the family home from others, apart from paying students. One of the most frequent visitors to 7 Cavendish Avenue was Jim Crowther, the newspaper man. A one-man clearinghouse of information about the activities of leftist scientists, he was a favourite of Mancy's, who entertained him and his wife Francisca as royally as rationing would allow. She could stretch to a cup of tea or 2, but biscuits and cakes were luxuries. After one get-together, Crowther lent her Somerset Maugham's On Human Bondage to help her improve her English and understanding of British foibles. Still worried that people in Cambridge thought of her as an outsider, she even sensed disquiet that she might be an enemy agent. Suspicions of aliens intensified with the town in the spring of 1941, when an innocent-looking Dutch seller of second-hand books in Sydney Street was unmasked as a spy. When he heard that military intelligence was onto him, he broke into an air raid shelter on Jesus Green and shot himself. During the Dirac's conversations with the Crowthers, Dirac heard Crowther's bulletins on the scientists' war work, delivered with his subtle political colouring, though almost certainly without the political edge that he reserved for conversations with more committed colleagues. Crowther knew that this was time well spent. Dirac would never commit himself to the cause of the left, but he was a powerful ally, if only because no other British physicist came close to his intellectual prestige. Although Dirac spent most of his time on war work, he was still thinking about quantum mechanics. In one project he collaborated with Peierls and Price to refute accusations made by Eddington that experts in relativistic quantum mechanics, including Dirac, were persistently misusing the special theory of relativity. This disagreement had been rumbling for years. In the summer of 1939, Sir Joseph Larmor had heard that Eddington has lately come to blows with Dirac. Dirac, Price and Peierls tried to make Eddington see reason. By the end of early summer 1941, their patience had run out, and they prepared what Price dubbed the anti-Eddington manuscript. The paper appeared a year later, and Eddington's arguments were crushed to the satisfaction of everyone except Eddington himself, who never accepted defeat. Having been awarded the Royal Society's Baker Medal, Dirac had to prepare a special lecture, where he presented some of his new thinking on quantum physics. In the early afternoon of the 19th of June 1941, when Dirac arrived at Burlington House, he saw that central London had suffered surprisingly little in the Blitz. Most of the damage had been done in the city and the East End. Giving the lecture was in keeping with the spirit of the hour. Londoners were going about their business as usual, and that included attending lectures about matters of no particular practical importance. Dirac rose to the podium at 4:30 p.m. to describe why he was so unhappy with the current state of quantum mechanics. Why is it, he wondered, that the first version, set out by Heisenberg and Schrödinger, is so beautiful, whereas the relativistic version is so diseased? It might be possible, he showed, to remove one of the pathologies of the relativistic theory, negative energy photons, using a technical device later dubbed the indefinite metric. Although not a panacea, the technique demonstrated to the standing army of quantum physicists that Dirac was still one of their generals. Even Pauli was impressed and wrote to Dirac to say so. Dirac's conclusion to the lecture was that the present mathematical methods are not final, and that very drastic improvements were required. He knew, however, they were unlikely to be made at a time when most of the best scientific brains were working on top priority projects for the military. Only rarely did the scientists on opposing sides communicate, and one such encounter took place in late September 1941, when Heisenberg travelled to Nazi-occupied Denmark to see Bohr. Bohr knew nothing of the Anglo-American project to build a bomb, and in a fraught meeting that was remembered and interpreted quite differently by the two men, the playwright Michael Fairn dramatized their discussion 6 decades later, in Copenhagen, a metaphor for the uncertainty principle. The more the intention of the participants at the meeting are probed, the murkier they appear to be. Although it will never be possible to know precisely what the two men said, one consequence of their meeting is now clear. Their friendship was damaged beyond repair after the meeting. Dirac was in touch with neither Bohr nor Heisenberg, and knew nothing of the meeting. When it took place, he was in Cambridge preparing for the new term, no doubt anxiously reading the news of the Nazis' invasion of the USSR, which had begun when Hitler unilaterally broke the pact with Stalin 3 months before. Kapitsa was now in Hitler's sights. On the 3rd of July, a few days after the pact collapsed, and Stalin joined the Allies, Kapitsa sent Dirac a telegram, one of the few communications that Dirac received from him during the war. In this hour of stress, when our two countries fight against a common enemy, I want to send you a final friendly word.